Good evening, everybody. Welcome. So pleased to get started. We're just a minute past 6. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome. My name is James Rondo. I have the distinct privilege and honor of being the president and Eloise W. Martin director of our great museum. It's my great pleasure to be with you as we take a careful, in-depth look at Takashi Murakami's Mr. Pointy, together with my longtime friend and excellent colleague. We now call her adjunct lecturer, Annie Morse, but Annie is so connected to our museum and its content that the title is almost independent of all of your achievements. We've known each other for more than 20 years, as I said. So for me, I don't think I've ever had the pleasure of actually introducing you, although we've done about 1 million programs together. So Annie, very familiar to me in all the best ways. I hope that she is a familiar voice to many of you here today. Most recently, Annie has given lectures around our groundbreaking Cezanne and Warhol exhibitions, to name but two, and a very familiar presence in the galleries as Annie leads regular public tours. We're so grateful for your contributions in broadening access to our museum's collections and our exhibitions. I know that you know our collections inside and out. So I'm delighted to welcome Annie today to discuss Murakami's inventive Superflat, quotation marks, Superflat style, and the very complex iconography of the painting, and put it in the context of our collection. Mr. Pointy came to the museum in 2015 as a gift of the Edlis Neeson Collection. Of course, this evening, I want to express the museum's deep gratitude to Gail Neeson, her late husband, Stefan Edlis, who we lost late in 2019. Stefan and Gail's profoundly generous support of our museum transformed our ability to share new narratives across departments and highlight it in programs like these. And I have to say, I worked with Stefan also for 25 years. Stefan, I remember when he acquired this work, he was particularly moved by this work, the work under discussion tonight, especially in terms of the incredibly intricate, delicate process of silkscreen, the layering of silkscreen evidenced on its surface. I remember him saying to me, I don't know how deep I'll go into Murakami, but this is a masterpiece. And so we're gonna unpack some of that tonight. Tonight's program is made possible by the Carol Given Winston Fund. Carol was a volunteer at our museum for 38 years, introducing students and visitors of all ages to our singular collections and exceptional exhibitions. The Winston Fund was established by Carol's family, friends, and fellow volunteers with the intention of inspiring all who share what Carol made plain, her love of art and learning. I know we have a number of museum volunteers in the audience tonight, who are returning to service this fall. Thank you. I'm grateful for your resolute commitment to our museum and to our shared mission. Our museum's volunteers care deeply about making our collections and our exhibitions accessible to all audiences, whether our local Chicago communities or visitors from around the country and around the globe. So on behalf of all of us at the museum, thank you. Programs like this are at the very center of our mission, and we hope this evening's lecture will encourage a deeper engagement, both among our volunteers and the public, with Murakami's Mr. Pointy. It's an immediate presence in the Irving Sten Jr. Family Gallery, Modern Wing Gallery. It's number 292. So I encourage you, as I'm sure Annie will inspire you to see it. So Annie, thank you for being here tonight with us. I always appreciate learning from you. So with appreciation to all of you for being here, and to our speaker, welcome Annie Morse.
Thank you. Thank you, James, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Edlis Neeson group for bringing us this incredible work of art, and thank you for Carol Winston's unbelievable contributions over time. I feel a little bit like, a politician with a memorable line like, "I knew Carol Winston, and ladies and gentlemen, I am no Carol Winston." So I hope that she would have enjoyed this kind of discourse, and I'm looking forward to the questions that you have later. We'll make time for that. Let me just get my tools here. They're very discreet. And get started with number one. This is not as big as I had hoped it would be. It is a big piece of art. Usually when we're showing work on screens, it blows a postage stamp-sized work of art up to mural size. Mr. Pointy's just about that big, and I do encourage you, I demand that you go into the galleries and look at it because it doesn't reproduce very well. It is a work of such overarching delicacy, complexity, and it's mysterious. We get to use this great French word, facture. The way it was made is not immediately obvious, and so you peer at it and get asked to move back by our security officers because you really want to dive into it. Those deep black pools are, they beckon with a kind of a come-hither glitter. It is at once glamorous, comic, slightly disturbing, provocative, and also full, absolutely rich and full with symbolism. When we sneak into a little bit of background on Murakami himself, I learned to my horror that in my notes when I wrote TM to stand in for Takashi Murakami, it immediately turned into a trademark icon, which in his case is a little bit appropriate. But the fact of the matter is this is an artist who, as hectic as his public persona seems to be, was classically trained. He was trained in art to the degree of having a PhD. He is someone who is both very learned and also a sponge for pop culture references. Some of this early work from, say, 2008, it's not even that early in his body of work, but you can see much more of the classical Japanese tradition of both beautiful textiles, Japanese woodblock prints, screens, the things that you will find in our galleries of Asian art in our Japanese collection. Some of those elements are present in these works. As we move forward, at 14, the pandas say they're happy. This is really high Murakami with the puffball, recollecting Mickey Mouse perhaps, the wide open eyes, the rainbow colored teeth, the wide smile. But you'll notice that everything isn't all roses and kisses in paradise as you examine the image a little more carefully and see that that happy face is emerging from a pile of skulls. The birth and death and glee combined with a degree of horror can easily be really dissected by people standing in front of a work of art. This, for example, is a lithograph, so it's a more manageable scope of work than Mr. Pointy, but all of his works reward close looking, and that includes such products as his wallpapers, which would seem to be very much of a muchness, repetitions of the same thing, but the discovery is in the details. Over the summer, I was teaching a class and asked my students to submit a work for the final class that intrigued or disturbed or otherwise piqued their interest. And Joy, you brought in Murakami's 69 arhats. Everybody knows exactly what an arhat is, right? Well, this is part of where contemporary art asks you to do a little bit of heavy lifting, is that it really does require sometimes that you go back in and Google something to find out what an arhat is. If you spend any time in our galleries of South Indian art, of South Asian art, you'll see the word bodhisattva repeatedly on the labels. The bodhisattva is perhaps a little bit better known in Buddhism as a being who has achieved all of the spiritual grace necessary to ascend into nirvana, but plans to spend more time on earth assisting those of us who are less perfect. The arhats are like that, only they're not such helpers. They're just ready to go, but you can't tell by looking, can you? That the bodhisattvas that we see in our galleries are idealized and beautiful figures, very often very handsome, striking men in beautiful robes that echo Buddha's own identity as a former prince. But these arhat that he has multiplied on multiple screens. This is not the most arhats that he has put together. Sometimes I think there's one that's at least 100 arhats. And before you get carried away thinking about what a hardworking artist Takashi Murakami is, be aware that there is a small army of assistants that are working with him. And I introduced this idea early because he likes to make himself out in interviews as kind of a stumble bum who's not really very good at this art stuff, which is entertaining in its own way, but he really is marshaling the talents and the skills of a host of people who are working under his direction. Now, this has disturbed people in the past when we think about the way Jeff Koons works, and does he or doesn't he actually have anything to do with his art? Is it all made by other people? If you go upstairs in our galleries, you'll see a late work by Rembrandt, and it's signed Rembrandt, but we're pretty sure it was a workshop production that Rembrandt signed. So does that make it any less a Rembrandt? He taught those people how to make the work that he could sign. He put the finishing touches on it. So it is the product of that artist's imagination. It's the product of that artist's will and the scope of their ambition. And to that degree, I think we can really agree that Murakami's work, despite having many hands involved, is truly his own work. Now, to think about our collection is to think about things, for those of you who are frequent visitors, things are deeply familiar. This Buddha from China is centuries old, but it's been sitting in a thoroughfare between the front door and the galleries that makes it seem a little bit like a friendly, welcoming face. It's actually an extremely important work, and it has all of the hallmarks that we need today for the points of classical Buddhist iconography that we can call out. You see this figure lacking arms, but draped in a delicate fabric, sitting on top of a lily, on top of a lotus. So I'll use these words somewhat interchangeably, but for our purposes, the lotus blossom, which is so important, is also the water lily. And this object, which recurs in world art, is universally appealing to artists and also in religion, because its roots are in the dank murk of the water of a pond, but the flower is so pure and beautiful and opens on the surface of the water, opening its face to the sun. So metaphorically, it's a very powerful symbol. And supporting the divine Buddha is a job that's fit for this very beautiful flower. You'll also notice the Ushnisha on top of the Buddha's head, and the urna, or the third eye, which you may or may not be able to make out here. Well, Mr. Pointy's point is not an Ushnisha, but it is in the place on a being's head where an Ushnisha would be. What I want to suggest here is that Mr. Pointy isn't a one-to-one collection of symbols of spirituality, but it draws freely. You know that line in the film when it says adapted freely from the book by so-and-so? This is free adaptation, but it comes out of a place of profound knowledge. Going through some of our Hindu sculpture, Shiva as Lord of the Dance is rich with gesture and symbolism in much the same way. And you see the flames around the wheel that Shiva puts into motion in his many hands. You can make out a flame with which the world is brought into being, as well as, or which destroys the world, as well as a drum, a little finger drum with which the beat of life is called out. His hands are in individual gestures, which some of you know as mudra. And the mudra are a language of gesture that conveys deep meaning and very profound significance for devotees who may or may not be able to read written text. So it's a visual language that goes back centuries and is interpretable with application, but it's also complex as any other vocabulary. Kartikeya, commander of the divine army, is seated on his vahana. That is a term that I want to familiarize you with. In this case, it's a very sturdy peacock, and I hope everybody can make out the peacock whose face is turned toward us, and the peacock has a cobra, or a snake, a serpent, clenched in its beak. So the combination of the deities with their vehicles, with their creatures that on whom they are often seen riding or mounted or seated, are pairs that suggest the connection between the divine and the earthbound, between those of us imperfect creatures like animals, but who also serve or desire to serve a more perfected being. The number of arms on Kartikeya is matched by the 6 faces that Kartikeya turns to be able to have a 360-degree view. In each of those hands is a different symbolic object, and it's that kind of multiplicity that Murakami draws from in his work. A very much more simple and I would say elegant, but that's unfair. It's a restrained image of Buddha with the left hand in a gift-giving gesture. That's a good example of the Varada Mudra, this open hand. You're going to be able to look at Mr. Pointy again and see how many of these elements Murakami has drawn in. But just wandering through the galleries of the Art Institute, you'll see these examples over and over again throughout culture. Here's a Thai Buddha triumphing over Mara with another gesture. And much later, and a tiny object, but you'll see that this Buddha is also seated on a stylized lotus blossom. In the galleries, the double-sided painted banner is easily overlooked unless you're going in the right direction through the Southeast Asian galleries. What you get to see in this slide, and I'm sorry to say that the color is nowhere near as rich as the color in the object itself. The image on the right-hand side is the one that is on view. The one on the left is turned to the wall. It's a double-sided banner. And like so many things in the museum, it was not intended to be hung on a wall or placed on a plinth. It was something that was intended to be processed and celebrated by celebrants and devotees. In this case, we have Shiva on the right-hand side with, you can perhaps see a round thing of the rosary for Buddhist meditation. On the right, on your right, yes, his proper left, is one of his immediately recognizable symbols, the trident. So when I think of trident, I default to the Greco-Roman god of the sea in that trident, but this is a really wicked-looking weapon. And we have to remember the muscular effort that these gods put forth to both preserve the world from demons, to trample on enemies. This particular incarnation of Shiva on the right is backed up with his female presence, Durga, his spirit element. On the right-hand side, he's seen astride his red bull, Nandi, and on the left, Durga is standing on top of a white mountain lion. So the connection between animal and human is identifiable and also significant and meaningful. Here's a little close-up, and it's pretty PG, but you'll notice that there's some modest genitalia associated with this piece, which doesn't bear too much explaining. You have the full image on the left-hand side with Mr. Pointy seated at ease, as you would have seen Shiva and his consort seated, floating above a figure, which we'll look at a little more carefully in a moment, seated above a mandala spinning with the rainbow hues, which don't show up quite as firmly here as they do both in the gallery and in the image outside. But then this beautiful lotus. Now, let's see how much detail we can call out here. All the way around the base of the lotus with its stem are individual faces that you can make out with little eyes and little noses and little mouths. So it's deeply programmed with the suggestion of living creatures, of a universe full of creatures. The lotus blossom itself and its immediately recognizable water lily leaves are something that are durably appealing to artists and to people who flock to the Arboretum or to Garfield Park Conservatory to see these beautiful flowers being grown in careful conditions. This creature is one that I particularly enjoy because they talk about it as a sphere, but you'll notice that it has, and it's gotten cut off here, I'm sorry to say, it has little arms and it has little legs. It has a little mouth and it has little eyes. I think that it's a turtle. I think it's the world turtle. And this is a 19th century illustration of the world turtle, also called the cosmic turtle or the world-bearing turtle. This is an image which looks so unusual to us that it seems as though it must have been very specific to a particular time, place, and culture. But in fact, this kind of stack of creatures bearing the world on their back is common to cultures like in South America, cultures in Asia, and if you read Terry Pratchett, an English comic science fiction writer, in Discworld, there's also a turtle bearing the universe. So the next time you run into somebody who's really advocating for a flat Earth theory, I think you can counter with this, and you will have the support of established and very cosmopolitan cultures through history. On the upper right-hand corner, I am sorry it is so small, but it gives you a slightly better view, which you will improve upon if you go to the gallery, of this little creature that I think is Mr. Pointy's vahana, or his vehicle. In the galleries, the lotus blossom blooms freely throughout culture. This is a charming little object from the Song Dynasty, something that we call Qingbai ware, this particularly beautiful pale celadon, light blue and green. You would light your piece of incense, and the smoke would waft up out of the pool as if it was a misty morning and out of the mouth of the duck. In the Chinese galleries, Chen Chun's Flowering Lotus from 1543 is not on view, but it gives you an idea of how absorbed artists through history have been with these large flat leaves that hold the dew like sparkling gems, but also float above seriously murky water. It's that sense of the sky as a bowl above us, the earth as a flat sphere, and the water having unlimited depths below us, uniting those aspects of universal experience or of our physical experience as earth-based humanoids, that this is the kind of thing that captures the attention of an artist and helps them to focus on the micro as opposed to the macro view. Harunobu's Gathering Lotus Flowers is part of a whole body of work that this artist made, woodblock prints showing beautiful women doing lovely things, relaxed in an environment. I wouldn't want to mess with her. She's got a rather sharp knife. And gathering the water lilies, I think, has its own significance, because once they're removed from the water, once they're removed from their root, they're not a woody stem. It's a fragile blossom, and part of its appeal and part of its power as a symbol is that it isn't something that lasts. It is something that is beautiful briefly, and then is gone. In our galleries of the ancient Americas, the carved vessel depicting a lord wearing a water lily headdress from what is now Mexico, but from 600 to 800 in the Common Era. In the upper right-hand corner, I hope you can make out, it's a very elaborate headdress. And in this culture as well, the water lily speaks to the connection between the watery underworld and the sunlit lands above. These works are on display, or this work is on display, as is this remarkable piece by Amasham, who is one of the people we know because he put his name on the vessels that are in that he made as a kind of a poet, painter, prince from an important family, which he notes in the hieroglyphs which have been deciphered on this vessel. But he decorates this very restrained element with water lilies. So you'll see this connection. It looks less like the lotus blossom and more perhaps like an iris or the lily in the field, but they spring from the same idea, and they're used interchangeably in a lot of cultures. There are 3 vessels by Amasham in our collection, which is really remarkable and very much worth visiting to get a sense of connection with the hand of the artist at such a great remove. One of the earliest pieces to enter our collection, this is from, was accessioned in 1895, was collected by Martin Ryerson. And if you've ever visited the Ryerson Library, it's named for him. This is really just a tiny little fragment of from the Greco-Roman period, meaning that it's probably trade goods and it could have come from a lot of different places. But you can make out that same tripartite figure in the border. This was something that was woven to decorate a garment or perhaps table goods or a shroud, we don't know, but that it has persisted that long or from that period is impressive for its materiality, for being on this rather delicate piece of fabric. Much more durable is the Egyptian relief fragment depicting fowling in the marshes. For years, we were frustrated in the museum because we couldn't show our Egyptian collection, and it's now back on view in Gallery 50 and so beautifully installed and so rich with great connections that can be made both among the objects in that collection and throughout the museum. So in this case, I think you'll be able to make out the water lilies that are used to demonstrate, here are the birds being trapped in a snap, and here's the very beautiful water lily, which is part of the marsh from which the more successful birds are flying away. On our mummy of Pa'ank-Enamun, we are overwhelmed with the detail, and this has been a kind of a celebrity at the Art Institute for many years. Recently, we had the opportunity to go up to Northwestern and, without disturbing the figure inside, examine its interior without taking it apart. What I wanted to show you here is the water lilies that are part of Pa'ank-Enamun's own path led by Horus to the underworld where he greets Osiris. And this Egyptian piece is really petite but so beautiful and so gracefully carved. The tomb wall fragment with donkeys, there's a whole herd of them here, and they're walking side by side. Above them, you see the flowers and their little graceful elements that decorate this particular carving. It's worth a visit. I hope you'll go down and see that as well. All right, fast forwarding to the moment of Japonisme, which is a startling change. This work is not in our collection proper. It was on loan to us for a long time from the Terra Foundation, and part of what made it appealing among our collection of American Impressionists is that Charles Courtney Curran sadly died young. He was a friend of John Singer Sargent. There were personal connections among these artists. But do you believe this exterior? I have a rather difficult time imagining those young ladies wielding oars and getting out into the middle of this pond so full, so choked with water lilies, that it seems almost impenetrable. That combined with the fact that they have to keep that parasol aloft for fear of getting tan, makes it an almost fantastic image. But oh my goodness, this man can paint, and he really is luxuriating in these enormous water lilies. Think about the difference in descriptive strategies of these two young ladies collecting water lilies and the two that we saw in Harinobu's woodblock print. It's the same topic, but it's a very different approach to telling the story of beautiful women, often compared to flowers themselves, collecting or harvesting flowers for their beauty. Now, the person who really put nymphaeas, water lilies, on the map for this institution significantly was Claude Monet. I'm not going to do a whole Monet at Giverny talk, but it's so important to recognize that the images that he made of water lilies were images from motifs that he created, that he diverted a stream to make the water lily pond, that he planted the beautiful, richly colored species that we see in his paintings, and that he built or had built the Japanese-style bridge. And it's all part, to some extent, like Mr. Curran, of an overwhelming enthusiasm for all things Japanese in late Victorian England, elsewhere, and especially in the United States. So when American visitors like Hutchinson or Ryerson went to visit Claude Monet, they crossed this bridge. They stood around on this bridge with Mr. and Mrs. Monet and chit-chatted. It was a creation of Monet's artistic sensibility, which has now come down to us almost unfiltered as something that sprang up naturally. But in fact, it's a very great act of landscape design and implementation of an idea that the artist caused to come into being. The water lilies appeal also to Eliot Porter. His pond with water lily leaves in New Hampshire clearly has some resonance with what we think about when we think about water lilies, which is Monet. That he is free in the 1950s as a modern artist, as a modern photographer, to show it as not only beautiful but also compositionally interesting, leaving the shadows to stand in for whatever is outside of the frame, allowing the water lilies to create a mat or mass instead of being strategically laid out as individuals the way we might expect to see them. So modern artists are also going to address and consider this flower and the way it interacts with the world around us. Now here's Murakami in a defensive position, which he probably learned from Kanye West, with whom he collaborated. This is from a more recent show, and you can see the happy flowers springing up on the line of daisies, I would say, happy little creatures that you can imagine singing a little song. You are to be forgiven if this brings back somehow inappropriate seeming memories of stick-on daisies from your junior high school snapper trapper. For me, I go back even farther, and unfortunately for me, I can't look at them without thinking of those adhesive things that go on the bottom of your bathtub, and they're heck to get out. I don't know that Murakami's thinking about that, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he was, because there is this high and low element that he's absorbed in. And there will be people who are driven mad by the commercial element and by the cartoony element. Anime is an acquired taste. Once you're absorbed in anime, you speak the language, you know how to read the books, you know what to expect and what makes a good anime or bad anime. In the world of Takashi Murakami, that high and low really does extend from your $14 cup to your let's just call it a $2,400 with tax bag. That was a collaboration that he entered into with Louis Vuitton, the luxury handbag makers, luggage makers, which has gone on for 20 years or went on for 20 years. Now, those of you who saw the Virgil Abloh show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago knew that some people didn't even really care about looking at the museum collection. They wanted to go to the shop on the 4th floor and buy all the stuff that you could buy that was this fashion designer's work. Is it art? That's a rhetorical question. You can take that home and think about it over dinner. But if the music of if a musician's output is art, and the cover art that a fine artist or a visual artist contributes to it is part of that art, it has definitely a commercial connection, because Murakami's work is going to make Kanye West's record even more saleable. That's a collector's item type, but still the image is associated with it. And West was profoundly associated with Murakami's museum shows, the opening of the Brooklyn Museum. You can watch all of the art stars of New York descend upon Brooklyn for this particular event, and you can see it on YouTube. It's not the way most of us consume art. Most of us consume art like our coffee cups, that we make a special trip to see something, and to remember it, we bring home a souvenir. We take home something that will allow us to recall the time we were actually in front of the Seurat, the time we actually saw Jackson Pollock, the time we actually saw Monet. And we don't confuse the coffee cup for the art, but Murakami pushes us to think that maybe there is more to it than that, and that maybe the commercial object is of equal value intellectually, and this is getting into the realm of conceptual art, that this is a marker for, or a signifier for. Now, what the Sam Hill is she doing with Andy Warhol? Andy Warhol's important, and not just because he is the pop artist with whom Murakami perhaps has the most in common, who was the most unfussed about his own intellectual identity as an artist, and the most upfront about, I'm doing this for the money, I am a business person. I think business is at least as interesting as art. All of these things can be found in the quotations of Andy Warhol. But what I found so fascinating is that the Campbell's tomato soup can really bears scrutiny in the same way we've been looking at Mr. Pointy. From the very top of this image, and this comes from the collection of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, from the top where we have a somewhat realistic representation of the rings on the can, which are there for a purpose. They're there to strengthen, to give greater concentric strength to the lid. The Campbell's logo was specially designed for them. It isn't a font or anything that had been in use before. It's from they had it made, so they caused it to be brought into being. Condensed is a sans serif font, and tomato is a sans serif font, but then you get soup, which has all these little frills on it and furbelows. It is a serif font. The badge in the middle, you are never going to look at that can the same way again. because what it turns out to be is a representation of a medal of excellence, which Campbell's got at the Paris Exposition of 1900. It's on every single can. And if you look at it closely, you can just make out the somewhat aggrieved-looking goddess Nike, who is carrying an athlete on her back. She looks like he weighs a little bit too much. And what in the heaven's name does he have in his hand but a flaming, not a trident, but what looks very much like Mr. Pointy's, one of Mr. Pointy's many attributes in his many hands. The winged figure, the wreath, all of these things are pregnant with symbolism that was brought to this rather modestly scaled medal, which is now possibly one of the most frequently reproduced images of the Paris exhibition of 1900 in the world, thanks to Campbell's Soup being so proud as to put it on all of their soup cans. And finally, last but not least, down there at the bottom, in gold, hand stamped on the original painting by Andy Warhol, are little lilies. So, Amasham, should he ever see a tomato soup can, would recognize those lilies as being a symbol of a flower, and the rest of us think of it as a fleur-de-lis and a symbol of French royalty. So it has all kinds of meaning mashed into this very humble object. And it gives us an opportunity then to look at Mr. Pointy in a different way, that it will reward our close looking and we get to use again the great art history word interrogation, that we're going to ask it questions. And to the degree that it's willing, it will answer, and we can find out more about it the deeper and deeper we go into this monumental piece. I hope that you will spend some time this afternoon or evening with this painting, that you'll be able to go back to the rest of the galleries and find some of these other artworks that have contributed to my growing understanding of the piece, and that you enjoy your relationship with the Art Institute as much as I do. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Here comes the lovely and talented Izzy with a microphone, and any questions that you may have, please speak into the microphone, and then they'll be effectively recorded, and I'll also be able to hear you. Take a minute to reflect, and then please join us. Hi.
Hi. Can you elaborate on your subtitle, the concept of superflat and how it relates to spirituality?
Yeah, thank you for taking me back there. We've looked at so many objects of religious devotion that the spirituality that is, I think, embedded in Mr. Pointy is both explicit and hidden. That Mr. Pointy doesn't derive uniquely from Buddhism, Hinduism, Mayan culture, or any of the other world cultures from which it is drawn, and yet it gains strength from it. And I think that is the spirituality that is offered, but not demanded by the work. And it's also goofy. I mean, it's quite goofy and friendly and welcoming, and the kids love it. But it's also rich with these details that go back in human history, literally millennia. Does that answer your question a little bit? The Superflat, actually, yeah. Thank you. Superflat was a word that Murakami coined himself, and often in the galleries we rather grandly say, well, it's a very flat painting, and people look askance because of course it's flat, it's a two-dimensional work of art. But there's so many ways that we calibrate flatness. There's flatness in a painting that doesn't have a lot of pictorial illusionistic depth. There's flatness in the way the paint is laid down on the canvas. There's flatness in the way objects, if there are objects or elements of the painting, are presented in a very forward-looking manner. And so there are modern paintings that are flat in all of those ways. There are paintings from the Renaissance that are almost inadvertently flat as they work out the degree of three-point, or how three-point perspective works. And Superflat is Murakami's way to just take that and put a twist on top and make it not just flat, but super flat, that the extra value of something like this pushes it forward into a kind of a hubris of this is the most flat that anything can be. And I don't know that it's necessarily true, and you can judge for yourself when you look at the work, because it does seem to have mysterious depths. And the nature of the screen printing process by which it is made gives it a perspective and gives it a surface that is almost sculptural, although it is very shallow. So there's a push and pull there that I think is really interesting. He claims one thing for it, but I think it actually expresses a different view. Any other question or comment anybody would like to make? I see a hand up there, or do I not? I thought I did. It's just a glare. Well, if nobody is going to bully their way up to the front, I am very happy to take questions one-on-one, but we'll let everybody go to dinner, and I'll just hang out back at the back if anybody has a question that they'd prefer not to ask in public. I'm, again, very grateful to you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you in the gallery sometime soon. Thanks, everyone.